The history of forex is one of the interesting topics you would want to know about. Forex trading, which is the art of exchanging flat currencies, is actually too old, but specific events really have shaped the forex market like how we know it now. Events like the Bretton Woods Conference in New Hampshire, the gold standard, President Nixon's decision, among other events. It is very important to note that before we began making transactions using currency, there was the barter trade system where goods were exchanged for other goods. For example, a person would salt would trade it for spices, or a farmer would offer his rabbits to the carpenter to fix his broken table. In fact, history has it that goods like salt were so popular as mediums of exchange during the barter system and would come to be used as wages for employees, hence the word salary. However, the barter system had its own flaws that led to its collapse. For example, having something that no one wanted meant that you wouldn't trade. Barter trade system involved exchange of goods such as people, and this caused a big public outcry. In fact, people trading was so popular during the barter system. The exchange wasn't fair in some instances, and over time people found it harder to trade unfairly. For example, it was very hard for the carpenter to trade his table to the farmer for vegetables. So eventually the bartering system was abandoned, and this gave rise to the commodities system. Certain commodities became widely accepted as a medium of exchange, such as the cowrie shells in ancient China and Africa, the koku in Japan, among others. The commodities system led to the gold coins becoming widely accepted as a medium of exchange, but were impractical to use because they were very heavy to carry, very scarce, and hard to mine during those periods. In fact, the amount of gold was known by measuring using scales, which was very time-consuming. A mixture of silver and gold led to the substance called electrum used to mint coins. This led to the coinage era. The coins were also widely accepted as a medium of exchange because they were uniform, easier to transport, rather than transport all your goods like in the bartering system, and gave people the liberty to trade what they wanted and needed. Needless to say, however, the coinage era also collapsed because it had its own disadvantages and flaws. For example, the coins could be counterfeited, were heavy to carry, and their weight would change over time due to normal wear and tear. This led to the Chinese to invent what we call the certificates. The idea behind these certificates was that private institutions would store their gold and electrum in exchange for these certificates, which were very easy to carry because of their light weight. These certificates later evolved to be known as paper notes and became widespread after Marco Polo visited China and brought the idea of paper money to Europe. Again, notes were so easily counterfeited, and also the private institutions responsible for keeping the notes issued more certificates than they had gold and electrum. As a matter of fact, it became so worse during World War I when countries printed more money than they had gold in order to pay for the war. This meant that confidence in these private institutions was greatly hurt, and this led to the rise of the Federal Reserve Bank, which would take over as the gold reserve center and issuer of certificates. Universal acceptance of the Federal Reserve Bank meant that all currencies were backed by gold. For example, $1 would equal to 2 ounces of gold, or maybe £1 would equal to 3 ounces of gold. That's just an example. This, however, meant that if there was a net transfer of currency from one country to another, gold had to follow, and all countries needed to maintain money supply to the specified fixed quantity of gold. Also, all countries had to be on the same page and agree not to print money just because. In fact, in this same period is when the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank were created. In this same period, 1944 to be exact, 44 countries came together in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, to come up with an idea of how to keep the currency exchange rates fixed. The gold system was too rigid, and they wanted something that was flexible, allowing them to print money but under check. The decision was that instead of pegging the currencies to gold, it was rather better to peg all other currencies to one currency, which would then be pegged to gold. And the currency chosen was the US dollar, simply because the US had 2/3 of the world's gold, so was therefore accepted as the world's reserve currency. In fact, it is important to know that we are not on the same system anymore, but the US dollar is still the world's reserve currency. The IMF was created to lend money to countries who needed it in order to keep them from printing more money. The Bretton Woods system was all good except that it greatly affected the US economy because US had to lend out money to countries, especially developing countries, to build their infrastructure. And in 1971, the then President Richard Nixon announced that the US dollar was no longer backing gold. So this led to the currencies to remain floating without any backing, hence the current floating exchange rate system, also known as forex. Floating exchange is not influenced by the government but rather by forces of supply and demand. And because of this, the value of a currency may change frequently and in a short time due to supply and demand. Forex trading is capitalizing on these changes in currency value for own profiting. So now you know the history of Forex. Are you ready to learn how to trade Forex? Learn from the very best and trade confidently. This is the Genius Super Trades.